Welcome back. Welcome back. And now let's continue looking at constructors. Right. A constructor is a special type of a method that meets certain characteristics. Firstly, a constructor must have the same name as the class name. Secondly, a constructor must not return anything. It does not have a return type, not even void. If you create any method that has the same name as the class, but then it has a return type, that method is not a construct. You would have created another method or another instance method, but not a construct. Now, what happens with object-oriented programming languages like C#, like Java, is that when you create a class and then you don't create a constructor explicitly, the compiler will create what's called a default no argument constructor for you, which you can use to create objects. That's why we are able to create an object by invoking a constructor that we would not have created. Now, we can create a constructor of our own. Like in this case, we have the constructor. Here. This constructor, it has the same name as the class of the name of the class that we had that time, which is employee. So the name of the constructor and the name of the class, they are the same. It's employee. And then this constructor is now setting the salary of employee to 300. Now, what happens is when you create a constructor like this, it means this constructor is going to set the salary of every employee to 300. But do we really need to have all employees getting the same salary? No, the employees may get different salaries. In fact, employees do get different salaries. So creating a constructor this way, where we are setting a particular field to a constant variable, to a constant value, it might not be the best way to do it. We would need to have each employee having their own value for salary. Okay. So as you can see again here, we have another constructor which is setting the ID number to 999. But do we say all employees will have the same ID number? Again, that's not it. So that means setting a constructor this way is not the right way of doing things. So again, when we are creating our constructors, we can put the constructors before the other methods, like just after the variables, the instance variables, then we have our constructor, and then we can have other methods. Okay. So like I'm saying, this one is setting the ID number to 999 for every employee, which means whenever we create an employee, the ID number of that employee is going to be 999. So this is not, it's not ideally, this is not the way things should be done. So for us to be able to set a specific ID number for each employee, we need to create constructors with parameters. In other words, we need to create what are known as parameterized constructors. So this is how we go about it now. When we want to set an employee ID, we're still going to have public employee. Now we have a parameter emp ID, and then it's that parameter that we're going to use to set the employee ID, which means whenever we create a new employee, we are supposed to specify the ID of that employee, and the ID of that employee is the one that is going to be set in ID number. Okay. So that's how we go about creating parameterized constructors. Again, constructors can be overloaded, just like we can overload the other methods. Just like we can overload any other methods, we can also overload constructors. And the rules for overloading constructors still remain the same as the rules for overloading any ordinary methods. You can have a constructor without argument, without parameters. You can have a constructor with one parameter, another constructor with two, another constructor with three parameters. You remember the rules for overloading methods from the previous classes. So those are still the same rules that we follow to overload constructors. Then we also have what are known as destructors. So ideally, constructor is from the word construct. So we use constructors to make objects. we use constructors to construct objects. We use constructors to set aside memory or to allocate memory for an object, or to allocate memory to an object. Now, after the object is done performing whatever it was meant to perform, we would then want to release the memory that had been allocated to that object. And to do so, we use what's known as a distractor. So a distractor, as you would probably guess, is the opposite of constructor. Construct, and then we have destroy. So we use a distractor to destroy an object. Now, when it comes to a distractor, it still has the same name as the name of the class. It does not have a return type, but then it has to be preceded, or it has to be prefixed with a tilde, like this one, this tilde here. That's the one that shows that this is a distractor. Now, unlike constructors, distractors cannot have parameters. As a result, you cannot overload distractors. So what it means is a class can have not more than one distractor. A class can have 0 or 1 distractors, but not more than one distract. So let's see an example of the class employee that now contains a construct and a distract. So here we have our class employee, and then we have our ID number, then we have the constructor. We are saying that this is a constructor because one, it's a method. We are saying it's a method because of these brackets. Its name is the same as the name of the class, and it does not have any return type. So this is a construct. It sets the employee ID, and then it displays the message employee object. Then it specifies the ID number, then created. Now, this is a distractor. We are saying this is a distractor because it again has the same name as the name of the class, and it's prefixed with a tilde, and it does not have any return type. So this is a distractor, which will simply display the message employee object, then the ID number destroyed. Then we have another class here, which is the main method. So if you are going to, we can now create a new object of employee. We can no longer write new employee in brackets without writing any arguments inside, because the only constructor that we have here is a one argument constructor that takes a variable of type int. So you cannot write new employee without passing any value here, because if you do so, you'll be trying to invoke a constructor that does not exist. So this creates a new employee with the ID 101. And when we come here and create another employee, this will create a new employee with the ID 202. So this is now making us able to create employees with different ID numbers, or with different ID numbers. Okay, so that's how constructors work. Now, what you need to know is the moment you create your own constructor, you won't be able to access the default no argument construct. So once you create your own constructor, you now need, if you need a default no argument constructor, then you have to explicitly create it. Okay, so distractor methods are automatically called when an object goes out of scope. So you don't necessarily need to invoke a distractor. Like in this case, you see we have constructed employee, and then it displays employee object 101 created. Then we constructed another employee, and it will display employee object 202 created. Now, once those two are displayed, they will then go out of scope, and then the distractor will be automatically invoked for employee 202 and again for employee 101. So you don't have to invoke a distract, but you have to invoke a constructor. Okay. So in summary, when you write programs in C#, you create two distinct types of classes: a class with the main method and a class without the main method. When you create a class, you create a class header and a class body. You remember a class header includes an optional identifier, an optional modifier, like an optional access modifier. And then we have the mandatory keyword class, and then we have the mandatory name of the class, the mandatory curly braces, and then the optional code for that class, for the optional class. Yes, the optional code for that class. You declare the attributes and instance variables for a class within the curly braces using the same syntax you use to declare other variables. Declaring a class does not create an actual object. Right? You remember that creating a class does not create an object. For you to create an object, you then have to invoke the constructor by using the keyword new, and then you write the name of the class followed by brackets. After an object has been instantiated, its public methods can be accessed using the object's identifier, a dot, and a method call. When you create a class that describes objects, you instantiate and another class that instantiates those objects. Okay. You create an object, you instantiate. So you create an object, you instantiate, and another class that instantiates those objects. In other words, we are saying you create a class with the main method and a class without the main methods. The class with the main method is the one that will instantiate the objects, is the one that will create the objects. Okay. So in short, that's that. Thank you.